Welcome to GeFam seminar. Today we have the pleasure of receiving Professor Mieke Meurs, and she'll be speaking about Carework and the new frontiers in research in that area. Professor Meurs is Professor of Economics in the Department of Economics at American University, Washington, D.C., where she also co-directs the program for gender analysis in economics. Her research and publications are mainly in feminist economics, Carework, and gender bargaining power. Her recent works include elder care and paid work, gender differences in the relationship between unpaid elder care work and employment in Bulgaria, and improving assessments of gender bargaining power, a case study from Bangladesh, which was at Feminist Economics. After the talk, we're gonna have 10 to 15 minutes to discuss, but you feel free to interrupt, participate along.
Okay. Thank you. So yes, so I want to echo that. We're kind of a smallish group, and I'm happy to have you interrupt or ask questions at any time, okay? I can share my screen, presumably. Yes, okay. You know, if I put it in slideshow, then I can't see you. So do you mind? I'm just going to leave it like this. And then if you can't see it's too small, I'll try to fix that. Okay, so thanks so much for inviting me today. It's really a pleasure to have a chance to talk to you and maybe to meet you if we get to chat a little bit later. So instead of talking about one particular research paper today, I thought it would be maybe more interesting for me to talk a little bit about how I see the field moving and some of the interesting areas I think for future research, and hopefully maybe inspire some of you on some new possible projects. My talk is Gender Analysis, Feminist Economics, and New Frontiers on Carework. I'd like to start by talking a little bit about gender analysis and feminist economics, because I think this is a nice kind of lead in to the Carework issue. So I don't think it's too necessary to talk in this group about why we care about gender analysis, but I did want to distinguish these two different kinds of motives, because I think we might have them in mind sort of all the way through the talk. So we care about gender analysis because we might care intrinsically about gender equity and about gender differences, right? So this analysis is needed if we're going to promote gender equality, which is a human right, right? A human right which is enshrined in the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the so-called CEDAW. And also it's a sustainable development goal, which many countries are focused on now. And I think this is really the important reason why we care about gender analysis. But of course, there's also a kind of instrumental motive that you read about a lot, I think, in standard mainstream publications, the World Bank and so on. That gender equity also helps promote productivity gains. It promotes economic growth. Of course, if half of the population has their capabilities not really mobilized fully, economic growth and productivity are going to suffer. And then for governments that have fiscal issues, there are also fiscal benefits to this. So I often use the example of South Korea, where they have a fertility rate of a replacement rate of 1.8 for every 2 people. They have terrible problems of labor force, decline. And they're really interested in getting women into the labor force, because if they do that, the women will pay taxes and will pay into the pension fund. And fiscally, that's very important for the country as they face this declining birth rate. So those are two different kinds of reasons why we care about these issues. And as I said, I think it's useful to keep both of them in mind as we go forward. Okay, so gender analysis is mainstreamed. I think this is absolutely a fact, right? These are just some examples here. So this is Esther Duflo, and her, she was a co-recipient of the 2019 Nobel Prize in Economics, partly for her work on gender, not only, of course. And then we have this UN Women publication, the Handbook on Gender Mainstreaming, right? And we see the World Development Report and so on. So I think there's no doubt that in a way, gender has arrived. Every project at the World Bank now has a gender component, which has to be, analyzed and so on. It's been mainstreamed. But I think there's really a lot more to do in the area of understanding gender. And I think that what I want to emphasize here today is that I think feminist economists, the people who are kind of go under this category, have a lot to say, which is important to add to how we do gender analysis in economics. So here, this is a slide that actually a colleague of mine put together. So we see Nancy Fulbray, a pretty famous feminist economist, Diane Elson. This is Amartya Sen, a feminist economists like to claim him. Up here in the corner, we have Seema Jayachandran. And do people know who this is in the middle? I didn't know either. My colleague had to tell me. It's Esther Boserup. So kind of the founder, I think, of the sort of gender and development people. So I'm trying to blend these things here, right? And to really argue that these pieces need to go together. So I want to take just a few minutes and talk about why I think that. So feminist economists would argue that an adequate understanding of gender issues and promotion of gender equality requires addressing some core principles of economics itself. Okay, so some of these core adjustments that feminist economists want to make is, for example, the first one, to emphasize human well-being and adequate standards of living as the central objectives of economic policy, as opposed, for example, to GDP growth or efficiency, which are more sort of mainstream economic goals. Feminist economists want to emphasize the role of reproductive work, that is, work reproducing the labor force, both for well-being and for the functioning of the market. And that means decentering the market. And I've come to really like this expression. So if you study economics, if you think about it, all we study is markets, right? That's what economics studies. If you pick up any economics textbook, you're studying markets. But lots of important economic activity, if we think of economics as how we organize our material lives, as I think it was Veblen helped us define it. I think that's who it was. Organizing our material lives requires a lot of interaction outside the market, in households, in the state, right, in other areas. And so if we focus on the role of reproductive work, reproducing the labor force as key, that also is going to affect not just well-being, but also the functioning of the market. Feminist economists bring a concern for inequality in the distribution of resources and power, and really reject the second fundamental theorem of welfare economics, which says that any reallocation is possible from any allocation, any redistribution is possible from any allocation. And the argument here is that that's simply not true, that certain technologies are adopted under one allocation, but they're not adopted under another allocation. And those technologies have distributional implications, so that really these two parts cannot be separated. And then finally, feminist economists bring to the analysis the idea that disadvantage can be multiply layered, right? So you might be disadvantaged as a woman, you might be disadvantaged as a Black woman, you might be disadvantaged as a poor Black woman, you might be disadvantaged as a rural person, right? And so there are layerings of disadvantage that economists need to address. So these are all fundamental principles which people who call themselves feminist economists, and you can notice that these things aren't about feminism, right? Which is why I think that the term feminist economics leads us to think about something, but what feminist economists are really trying to do is much more general. And that brings us to the next slide. Sorry, this is not very well formatted, but this is Eleanor Ostrom. She was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize in economics, also shared with George Akerlof. Eleanor is actually not an economist. She's a political scientist, but did a lot of quantitative and analytical work. And she argued that gendered economics is good economics, good science, and good econometrics, right? So the point is, a feminist economist is not about feminism so much, it's about reforming economics to do economics in a slightly different way. So Julie Nelson, a feminist economist, wrote in the Journal of Economic Perspectives that many readers may have discovered that they are already doing feminist economics in some ways, although they have preferred to think of themselves as just doing good economics. Indeed, feminist economists wish that they lived in a world where the label need not exist, right? Where we just did good economics, which took these concerns that I've been listing seriously. Okay, so now I just want to dig just a little bit deeper into these fundamental principles, I think, of feminist economics as a kind of a springboard for talking about care work. So we're all familiar with this, right? This is a nice circular diagram that we probably all teach in our introductory courses. And what we see here about households, is that households are suppliers of factors of production. That is to say, labor to firms, right? And then, of course, they buy goods and services from firms. But what seems to be missing here is that while firms produce goods, somehow households are never thought about producing those factors of production. Right? So feminist economists want to really focus our attention, our analytical lens on the reproduction of the labor force as an economic process, right? And so this is a image that's actually on the cover of one of Nancy Fulbray's books. And it says here, capitalism also depends on domestic labor, but actually, any economy, right? Socialism also, since I study former socialist countries, socialism also depended on domestic labor, right? Economies depend on domestic labor. And so this image here, this is an assembly line, right? And these women are producing the labor force on the assembly line, trying to bring attention to the fact that, as Shahra Razavi, who was, when she said this, she was at UN Women, she's now at the ILO, she says that the household reproduction of the labor force is neither free nor automatic, right? And that means that we as economists need to think about the costs of this production and also about how to make sure that it gets done and it gets done well. So that's kind of the first fundamental principle. And then the second fundamental principle that I wanted to dig just a little bit more into is this idea about structural inequalities, that economies are places where there are kinds of structural inequalities. So that, and here again, this is the feminist economist, I think, take on gender, is not just that there's differences, in wages or employment rates or something. No, that the people who are coming to the markets and experiencing these wages or employment differentials are coming out of a position of structural inequality, right? So I use this diagram a lot. I'm sure that Anna has probably seen it more than once in my class, because it brings together all of these pieces. So the idea from this picture, I believe this comes from the World Development Report actually, is that each of these parts of the economic whole, so markets, informal institutions, households, and formal institutions, all of them are gendered. And the gendering of each of these aspects then affects economic outcomes. So that when we're studying gender inequality and opportunities and agency and endowments, whatever these outcomes, that we need to look back and find the causes, right? And look for the explanations in these structural inequalities. So in markets, for example, I love the example of markets because it's kind of your quintessential gender neutral institution, right? What's gendered about markets? Like nothing. It's just a system of prices. It doesn't care if you're a man or a woman. Well, that's true. But, if you have differential access to land or credit or labor, and you then go to the market from a position of not having those resources, then you're going to be in a much different position in the market than you would have been if you had more access to those resources, right? So that the market becomes a gendered institution when people who come to it don't come on an equal footing, right? Or of course, there's also discrimination in markets, which didn't make its way into this picture. Then informal institutions, of course, we know that social norms treat people differently. Laws, inheritance laws, ownership laws, et cetera, still in many countries treat men and women differently. Think about the titling of land or who holds the title to households, people's homes. And then I want to emphasize, because again, this comes back to the care work I want to talk about today, households, right? So households are also very structured, gendered institutions. I don't think probably to a group of women, I don't need to explain this too much, right? Different people, different kinds of people do different kinds of things in households. So just quickly, here's some data to support the picture just a little bit. So this is one things, sort of emphasizing the inequality of what people can do in markets. So this is some survey data collected by the OECD from a number of OECD countries. I can't count actually how many that is on the horizontal axis, but quite a few. And the individuals in the countries were asked, do you have access to the money you would need if you wanted to start or grow a business? And the blue bars are the answers that the women gave. Yes, I have access. And the diamonds are the answers the men gave. Yes, I have access. Okay. And you see that in almost every country, not surprisingly, men report having more access, or more men report having access to the money they would need to start or grow a business than do women. Oh, I didn't get this slide. Oh, well, sorry. This was a slide that I never added. I'm sorry about this, but you can picture here a graph showing the amount of time in unpaid household work of men and women. And you can imagine it fine. You don't need the picture. Okay. And so then the last piece on this introduction that I want to show is this one. So this, again, sorry about the formatting. If I show it in slideshow mode, you don't see all this stuff, but this is again from the OECD. So here, the researchers tried to calculate the income loss associated with discriminatory social institutions, that is, those gendered institutions that I showed in the previous picture, by region. Okay, these are annual losses, right? And so you see that these gender inequalities, and this is where I was saying that we can think about two rationales for caring about gender inequality, right? One is because it's a human right, and the other is that it's very costly to have these inequalities. Okay, so now I want to turn my attention to talking about care work, but does anyone want to jump in and say anything before I go on about the first part? So I'll keep going. We can, but as I said, feel free to interrupt. Also, if I'm talking too fast, you can wave at me. Slow down. Okay, so now I want to talk about care work. So care work I see as a really important emerging frontier in gender analysis in economics, but really growing out of the feminist economics points, that well-being is really important, that a huge part of what happens in the economy that we care about takes place outside of markets and in households, right, and so on. So I think it's really been pushed by the feminist economics approach. So care work is important in supporting gender equality in paid work. Right? So even if you don't care about reproduction, you might care about care because it affects women's participation in paid work. And this, again, I was trying to make the point that feminist economics says it's not enough to notice wage differences. You need to ask why, and you need to show what are the institutions that are causing these wage differences. So we know that there is a relationship between unpaid work and women's labor force participation, in female labor allocation, that is what kinds of jobs women are able to take, and in wages in female dominated sectors, right? Because women often are in these care jobs, right? And so if you have bad wages in care jobs, that affects gender equality in work, right? Care work is also, I think, really emerging as a frontier because people have started to pay more attention to the impact on human capital development, right? Especially in low-income households. So if low-income mothers mostly are not able to provide enough time on, caring for their children because of the pressures of paid work, then we can have human capital implications. And maybe I'll just take a slight detour to talk about one little piece of research I worked on. I was working on some data from Tajikistan, which is a very poor former socialist country in Central Asia. And I was doing this project because I was very annoyed by a conference I went to at the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome, where they were working on projects to create employment opportunities for rural women. But the assumption seemed to be that these rural women were sitting around doing nothing, and if you showed up with jobs for them, they would just jump up and take the jobs and nothing else would happen. And I found that very upsetting. Many rural women that I know work very long days without paid jobs, right? Collecting water, especially in Tajikistan, people have to fetch water for hours and hours every day, and so on. So anyway, the data project I was engaged in was a simultaneous equation model looking at the decisions of participating in paid work and unpaid work and childcare. So unpaid work, think like fetching water; paid work, obviously the job, and care. And one of the things I found very surprising in my results is that women who I thought, were so time constrained, they did take up paid work when it was available. But since they couldn't not collect water, the place where they cut back their time in order to take up the paid work was on childcare. So they would leave their kids, alone in their little house in the countryside or whatever, and go and do paid work because it was easier to give up childcare than it was to give up water, right? So I think this is very important, as I said, particularly for low-income households, that this issue of care work is important for human capital. And then on the elder care side, when we talk about why is this important, it's a little more challenging because we can't argue that it's an efficiency enhancing, growth enhancing investment. But I think as a human right, ensuring kind of dignified existence for elders is very important. And that, that is the argument on the elder care side. Okay, so if we want to take on this challenge of understanding.
Can I ask you something? Yes. You said that when these women were able to get a paid job, they got the job. They want to go to a paid work, and they leave kids alone in order to go to pick up water.
Well, okay, so this is the statistical analysis. So I guess I'm really just talking about the relationships, what happened. But
yes. But no, I was thinking about what happened when they didn't have the paid work, for example, and they were at home with their kids and they had to go to pick up water.
Yeah. So what you see is that compared to women who don't have paid work, right? The women with paid work do the same amount of fetching water, but they do less childcare, right? So imagine, I guess the mental exercise is like, imagine all of them with no paid work and how they divide their time between childcare and water collection, right? But to get really more to the answer to your question is they take the kids with them,
Okay.
Right? And it's kind of astounding. One person I was talking to was talking about watching a woman climbing down this steep embankment to a river with a bucket in the winter with small children clinging to her. I just found this description terrifying, Yeah. So she couldn't leave them alone, so she took them along, right? But I think if you think about all the childcare hours, she was giving up some other kind of time when maybe she was cooking them or bathing them or washing their clothes, right? Or reading to them or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah. Good question. Okay, so, sorry. So I just also wanted to say the obvious, that COVID, of course, has this attention, this emerging frontier existed before COVID, right? It had become a really emerging area, but COVID obviously gave it a big push because every man who thought that care work was not important was now stuck at home with his family all day, right? Watching care work. And I think it really got a lot more attention and so that's been helpful to us. Okay, so if we take seriously the need to look inside the household as economists to understand the production of humans in the household, then what are some of the things that we need to do? So I want to talk about just a couple of areas of research. So one task is to show the impact of the care burden on paid work, right? So to convince people, governments, employers, and so on, that it does affect women's participation in the paid workforce, and therefore it affects your fiscal health, right? It affects your growth rate, and so you should pay attention. So there's been a lot of work in this area. There are many, many studies now showing that having elder care responsibility can have impacts on women's paid work. So there's a very strong literature from the United States. There's good research from Japan. I have a paper on Bulgaria. There's papers on China. Actually, I have not seen very many papers on global South countries. There are some papers on comparing across Europe, different European countries. The evidence is mixed. So in some cases, you find a clear, strong relationship. If you have dependent elders at home, you as a woman are going to engage less in the paid workforce. You're less likely to be employed. Okay. And the impact is more on whether or not you're employed than on your hours. So you're more likely to be not employed. But the evidence is mixed. And in Japan, for example, they didn't find a relationship. And I'll say just a little bit more about this because I'm going to talk now about the technical issues. So this is a very hard thing to study because who gives care is endogenous, right? You may or may not have an elderly parent who needs care, but if you have one, whether you're the one who provides care may be endogenous to your employment status, right? So there's a nice study from Colombia. The study actually is looking at agricultural workers on flower plantations. But one of the things that they find is that the older people who need care end up getting sent to the households of the sibling with the weaker employment situation, right? Who's going to take care of grandma? Well, you don't have a full-time job, or you're unemployed right now, or you earn a really low wage. So here, grandma's going to come to your house. And those of us who, are doing better in the labor force, we're not going to take grandma because we'd have to give up our good job or our good wage or whatever, right? So there's an endogenous relationship between the employment and the care need. It's not exogenous. So that's complicated. So there's a kind of a two-stage least squares approach that people use to estimate, how likely is it that this person would need care. And sometimes when you correct for that, you find that in fact, the relationship was endogenous and you get less of an impact if you control for the endogeneity. But sometimes, this is interesting, you don't find it's endogenous. So there's a nice paper on China where the authors argue that in China, it's such a strong social norm that the daughter-in-law cares for the mother-in-law. And because in China, they basically only have one child, right? Caring for the mother-in-law is not endogenous to your labor status. You care for the mother-in-law if she needs care, no matter what. So, and they used the two-stage least squares correction there and just showed that it didn't have any impact. It was not an endogenous relationship. But another possible issue, technical issue with this is that it can also have to do with unobserved characteristics of the individual. So I might be fully employed, and so maybe it seems like grandma wasn't sent to me because I had a poor employment status, but actually I'm just not a very dedicated member of the workforce. I don't really like working. I'd rather stay home and care for grandma. I'm an introvert. I don't like having to go to the office, whatever, So individual personal characteristics can be unobserved factors in the decision to leave the labor force and care for grandma. So having data in which you can use individual fixed effects so that I can watch you before grandma and after grandma, right? And control for the fact that you're you is very useful. And when you control for those individual fixed effects, that's where in Japan, they found that the impact went away, right? But this isn't true in all cases. So the data is very mixed, I guess. And that's one reason why I'm presenting this here as work still to be done, because the results are not consistent. And I think they're not consistent because of these technical issues, but also because policy contexts and social contexts matter a lot, right? If you live in Denmark, where the government provides high quality institutions where elders can live, comfortably and with dignity and with, and nice activities and friends, you're not going to have the same elder care impact on your employment as if you live in, I don't know, Bulgaria, where there are no institutions at all to help you, right? So policy context matters. As my China example showed, social context and social norms matter, right? So I think there's a lot of additional room here for studying the relationship between the care burden and paid work in different policy and social contexts. And last thing I'll flag on this slide is that I haven't seen any analysis. In fact, one of my undergraduate students was proposing to do an analysis of the impact of specific labor market kind of institutions on the relationship between care burden and employment, right? So, does it matter that Denmark has those kinds of institutions compared to the US that doesn't? Does that affect the relationship between care burden and paid work? As far as I know, nobody has done that. And so I think that's an interesting area. So kind of repeating a similar story is on the childcare side. So on the childcare side, the evidence is more consistent. Having children under the age of 3 years has a consistent negative impact on women's labor force participation. This is not very surprising. This is true in studies that I just happen to know about are on the US, on Germany. I have a paper on Kazakhstan on this. This again, does present some technical issues for analysis because young children can also be endogenous, right? I haven't had kids yet, but I want to have kids. I'm unemployed right now. Maybe this is a good time to have my kids, right? Or I'm going to get laid off next year or whatever. I'll have my kids now. So one of the interesting things that people have done to address this endogeneity is to look at the year of birth of these kids and when they start school, right? And look at kids just on each side of that cutoff, right? To look at the impact of having kids before school age on employment. So using different kinds of institutional dates which transition children's care need, and then looking at kids on each side of that date. But then you have to have very specific and nice data. And again, I think here what's missing in the research is the policy link. So we don't know very much about how the impact of care for young children affects women's labor force participation comparatively across policy contexts. And one of the problems we have with this kind of research is that it's true for elder care too, but for childcare, issues like locality and quality are very important. So in the data, you might know that in this municipality, there are a certain number of childcare centers per child of childcare needing age, but you won't know how close they are to people's homes, right? And you probably won't have any data on the quality of the care in those centers. And so that it's a little bit of a problem to tell, whether the problem is availability of care or some other kinds of issues. Okay. The next area for possible future exploration is as I have been emphasizing, this connection between policy and impact. So there is some interesting research, I think it's interesting, mostly from Europe, looking at what are being called gender regimes or care regimes. And so these are basically typologies, looking at different kinds of patterns of institutions that exist. But in general, they don't really link to outcomes for women, like employment outcomes, wage gap outcomes, promotion outcomes, and so on. But I'll just show you a little bit of the research. So this is a paper by Saraceno and Keck from 2010. This is looking at policy contexts on responsibility for children. So you see here on the vertical axis, this is childcare coverage for children 0 to 2. They look at children 0 to 2 because by the time kids are 3 in these European countries, most of them go to preschool. So they're not an issue for childcare in the same way as smaller children. And this is where the countries really vary, is in how they treat very small children. And then on the horizontal axis, we see a measure of parental leave presented as a z-score. The size of the bubble is the amount of spending. Okay, and I think one of the things that's really interesting here is how different countries are, right? So take Belgium, for example, here. Belgium has hardly any parental leave, but lots of childcare for infants, right? So that makes sense, right? People aren't going to get a leave, so they should have childcare, and then they can just go right back to work. And then over here, some of the former socialist countries, Hungary and the Czech Republic, for example, they have lots of parental leave, like 3 years of paid parental leave, but they don't have any childcare for kids under 2, right? And that makes sense too. Everybody has a leave, just stay home and take care of your kid. There's no childcare centers. But then you have these other weird things like here. So like the Netherlands, right? Or Portugal, where you see there's very little leave and there's very little child care for infants. So now what do you expect is the outcome? What's going to happen?
Less female participation,
right? Women
in the labor market.
Right.
The labor market, yes.
Yeah, unless of course you're a well-paid lawyer and then you hire a full-time nanny, right? But for a lot of people, that's not a choice, right? And then you have places, like Denmark, where they have both, right? You have leave and you also have childcare, and you feel very supported. Okay, and then this is the data on elder care. So there's less data on this, so it's a little harder. So here we see people in institutional care as a share of the population. It's hard to know exactly what to make of that, because in some countries like Denmark, care means a very civilized apartment building where you live with other elders and there's help available if you need it. And in some other countries, it's like a place where destitute people who can't take care of themselves go when their family doesn't care for them anymore, right? So it's a real mix. But anyway, what share of the population is there? And these are the minimum non-contributory pensions as a share of net income, right? So that is to say, if you didn't earn a pension and you're just getting the basic government supplied pension, what do you get? So what's the financial support for elders? So again, I don't think these are great measures, but this is what the data provides. But again, you see such huge differences, right? So I guess this is Latvia, right? They have very, very low pensions. And in Belgium, again, you see a much higher minimum pension. Very few people in institutions in Bulgaria or Latvia. That's because they don't have any institutions, so you couldn't be in one if you wanted to. And then, much higher percentages of people in institutions in some countries where I happen to know they provide very high quality institutions, like Sweden and, is that Sweden? I think so. And the Netherlands, right? So as I said, these are typologies. The whole analysis in this paper is to create these typologies to help us understand what bundles of institutions countries provide. And, for a paper I was working on, I provided a very rough, 2x2 correlation of wage gaps with these institutions of childcare. And you see you can eyeball a rough relationship, but we don't have nice econometric studies that look at how do these institutions affect people's labor market outcomes. And so I think that that's also a very, interesting area for future research, because it's helpful for governments. They're trying to make decisions about policy, right? And one of the arguments is that there are going to be fiscal benefits, right? If women can enjoy these supports to help them with their care burden. A third, I just have 4 in case you wonder if I'm going to go on forever. A third area where I think we need to have some more research, which is very open at the moment, is to estimate care deficits. That is the needs of the population minus the care that's currently provided. So the research on care to date has really emphasized collecting data from time use surveys on how much care is provided, right? But that doesn't tell us how much care is needed. I mean, go back to my Tajikistani women again, there was more care needed there, I'm pretty sure, but it wasn't available. And we all, I think, also know that elder care is very undersupplied in many situations. There are elders who are home alone, with no one to help them with anything. So this is, and right now in the literature, what exists is basically kind of sociology papers that interview people and describe, people saying, I need more help, there's a care deficit. There's no, that I know of, empirical estimate of a care deficit. So I'm working actually with a Brazilian co-author on a paper now, trying to make a stab at estimating a care deficit. But it's complicated. So I'll just talk a little bit about this. So, we have some information on care that's provided. We have administrative data, right? So most countries, I think every country, reports preschool enrollment rates for children 0 to 2 and 3 to 6. But of course, that only tells us whether they're enrolled. It doesn't tell us how many hours a day they go there, right? But then we have time use surveys, and time use surveys normally tell us how much unpaid care is provided in the home, right? So we might know that paid care is available, 5 hours a day, and that at home, from the time use surveys, it says that women provide another 3 hours a day, and their husbands provide another 1 hour a day, and that's what we have. But there are some issues here. So first of all, supervisory care is what we call the time when you're not actually bathing your child or helping your mother, put her shoes on, but you can't leave because the child or the elder cannot be left alone. Okay, so it's important to count that as care time because you are not available to do something else during that time. You could not take a job, right? Or go do community service or cook dinner even, maybe, because you have to be doing this thing, depending on what it is. So we need to count that as care time because it cannot be used for something else. You can't leave, you have to stay there. It's very underestimated in time use surveys. The way it's supposed to get recorded is that you write down that right now you're cooking dinner, that's your main activity, but as a secondary activity, you're also present in case the children need you. Okay, it should be in your secondary activities. But very often people don't recognize supervisory care as work, as care, and they don't report it. So this is a sense in which the provided care here is, we don't have a great estimate of it because we're not actually counting it very well. And then elder care is another area where we just get tremendously tiny estimates. I'm going to show you this on another slide, actually, so I won't go into too much detail there. But then a third kind of piece of missing data on the provided care side is care that's not provided by people in the same household. So time use surveys only ask you about care you're providing to people in your household. If it's something that you're doing for a family outside of your household, it gets coded as being a visit to another household. Or if you're doing it as a community, like to a community member and not a member of your family, it probably is coded as leisure. So Nina Banks, an African-American author, has pointed out that in the African-American community in the United States, that a lot of care is provided through communities. So you might go and provide, dinner for someone from your church who is old and can't care for herself, or you pick her up on your way to church and take her to church with you, or you go over and help her do her bills once a month, because she can't do that anymore. And that kind of community interaction, there's no category for that in the time use data. And so it gets counted as some kind of like leisure community activities. So on the provided side, we have pretty good data, but it's not complete. So this is just some evidence on the incompleteness of the elder care data. So in China, this is from the China time use data, by the way, is very good. In households with at least one member 75 years or older, so these are people who are quite old, right, and likely to need some help, rates of participation in the care of elderly or disabled people is 3% for women and 2% for men. Okay, these are not time. This is, I participate ever in this activity, even 1 minute a day. Okay, so 3% of women and 2% of men report that they ever engage in any activity caring for an elder person in their household. So this data is simply not credible. It's not possible. And it just emphasizes the fact that people don't recognize this work and they don't report it in the time use surveys, which are the basis for our data on provided care. Other data from Colombia, looking at across all the households in actual time, now not participation, shows that the highest amount is 1 hour a week. And this is reported by women who are 70 years old or older, and they're reporting time caring for their spouse. Okay. So again, I find this data absolutely not credible. If you're a 70-year-old woman caring, for an elderly spouse, I doubt very much that you spend 1 hour. And also, it seems very strange that other people in the data set all report less. So this elder care is very undercounted, and we need to learn better how to elicit, more complete responses from people if we want to calculate the care deficit, if we want to know how much care is provided. But the provided part is the easy part. The needs part is much harder. So what do we know about care needs? So for, I have some more slides. Yeah. So for children, small children, what's been recommended is something called a residual method. And I'll talk more about this in another slide, and I'm going to go a little faster so I can wrap up. So, but basically the idea, the intuition here is that small children need to be watched all the time. And so you can basically just subtract what they're already getting from their total time needs, right? And find the gap. For older children, it's complicated. How much time does your 12-year-old need? Or your 15-year-old? There's literature suggesting 15-year-olds are more dangerous to leave alone than 12-year-olds, right? So, what would be the care need for children who are older and don't need 24-hour care? We really have no idea. And for elders, it's even more complicated because some 80-year-olds don't need any help. And some people who are 60 are, already really, needing a lot of help. So it's very challenging. So here's just a little bit more data on that. And then I want to get to the last point. So this is from an analysis of data collected in Australia in 1997. So they show that women who worked outside the home for 8 hours a day spent on average only 24 minutes less on childcare than those who were not employed. Okay, so there's something very strange about this, right? And it suggests that the amount of time that the women who are home all day are reporting must be somehow underestimated because they were at least doing supervisory care, right? During those 8 hours that they were home. And another interesting survey, just kind of suggestive evidence, again, on the undercounting of care, is this study in the 2000s of new mothers. Okay. And when they look at new mothers, they find that new mothers, of course, and no surprise, right, to any of us, spend all of their time in the company of their infants, right? Because you can't put your infant down unless you give it to your spouse briefly. And that because infants are so fragile and needy, it preempted anything else pretty much that they could be doing at this time. And yet, when you look at the survey data from these mothers, they do not report that they are doing 24-hour day care or anything anywhere near that. Okay, so the residual approach is to take all of the minutes in a day, 1,440, and then you could subtract out how many minutes of care are provided, and that would give you the gap, right? So in South Korea, they looked at this and they saw that there were 1,440 minutes a day, and then there were 235 minutes of direct care. And then there's sleeping time, right? But and you must assume that these kids are having supervision while they're sleeping, but it leaves a very large amount of time unaccounted for. And so again, it suggests that the surveys really undercount supervisory care of children. The problem for elders, as I said before, is that we don't know how much care they need. We know infants and children under 2, let's say, have to be cared for all day long, but we don't know about elders. We can't use age as a criterion as we do with children. And also, in many cases, elders are providing care, not needing care, right? Grandmothers are such an important source of childcare across the globe, and also cooking dinner, right? And also doing the laundry. And so we can't just assume that they need care. But some studies, show also that the need for care is very context specific. So in Ghana, a poor country, right, where people don't get great health care and live difficult lives in many cases, over 50% of people age 65 to 75, so under 75, require some assistance with activities of daily living, right? If you looked at people who are older than 75, it was 65% of them. Then if we look at the US, only about half of all adults requiring services are over 65. So about half of them are under 65, right? And this is not a country where people lived like in Ghana, but care may be intermittent. They don't need care, every day. Maybe they need care once a week and so on. So how do we estimate a care deficit, for elders? It's a complicated thing to think about, but very important. Again, if you're trying to make policy, you need to know what are the gaps in care that we need to fill. Okay.
Mieke,
Yes.
here in Brazil, we have a lot of families that we call they live not only the family live the nuclear family live with some elder people, for example, mother-in-law or father-in-law, and it's very important for women to be able to work.
Mm-hmm.
So it's what you're saying, that elder provide care.
Right, that's right. So that's what makes estimating the gap so hard, right? Okay, the last thing is just, I think, 3 slides that I want to flag for you in terms of interesting research areas is macroeconomics. So macroeconomic modeling, there's now a big effort underway, part of which was based at American University, to incorporate the care sector into macroeconomic models. So, in macroeconomic models, typically you have to stylize things. You might have the agricultural sector and the, industrial sector. So in this case, the effort is to incorporate us as a distinct sector, the care sector, into the economy. And I wrote Arrow here on my slide because I'm pretty sure it's Kenneth Arrow who made this comment a long time ago, which helps us understand why you need to incorporate the care sector into the macroeconomic models. He said, if you marry your housekeeper, GDP goes down. Right? Because the work that used to be in the paid sector and was getting counted in GDP now is getting done in the unpaid care sector and is no longer getting counted in GDP. Because of course, Kenneth Arrow, if he married his housekeeper, he wouldn't pay her for the work she was doing in the household. So this is important because when we calculate what's the decline in output during a recession, we imagine that everything that disappeared from the paid sector disappeared altogether, when in fact, a bunch of it is still getting produced, but in the unpaid care sector, right? I withdrew my child from the child care center and now I'm caring for her at home. She's still being cared for. Someone is still producing care, but not being paid, right? So we totally misestimate the changes in output when things move between the paid sector and the unpaid sector in economic cycles, if we don't incorporate this, right? And of course, we can't also do good policy analysis if we can't incorporate this into the paid care sector. So suppose that we want to implement a child care subsidy and the government wants to know what will be the impact of this. So right now we do like partial equilibrium analyses, right? And we say, oh, the impact on women's employment, about 5% more women will take up employment. Okay. But once they do that, then the wages in the childcare sector might go up, right? And also the taxes women pay are going to go up, and their the pension benefits are going to go up, and all of these things need to be traced through the macroeconomy in order to really see the overall aggregate impact of this changes in childcare. And we have not had until now models which allowed us to do this, to trace these policy implications through. Okay, so what I'm reporting on here is a paper done as part of this project at American University by Martin Sikowitz and Hans Lofgren. And so what they did was they did a computable general equilibrium model, a CGE model, and they modeled 4 possible changes, okay? Oh, sorry, they modeled, 3 possible changes. And they looked at the way that would impact the time women spent in paid care, the time they spent in unpaid care, women's labor force participation, and the changes in women's wages. The policies that they looked at in this modeling exercise were a 15%, a 0.15 percentage point increase of, 0.15% of GDP increase in government spending on childcare, a 0.15% of GDP increase in spending on elder care, and an effort to reduce by 50% the wage gap between the average wage and caregiver wages, because caregivers are very poorly paid. And these are the results. And I just think this is a super interesting exercise. So here what we're seeing is the impact of each of these categories of policy. So this is the spending on childcare, the spending on elder care, reducing the wage gap is yellow. Okay, and we'll just focus on those. And then this is the combination of all policies. Okay, so this is GDP total care. That means care in the paid sector that gets counted in GDP. Okay, so if you subsidize childcare, that's the blue bar, then you see that total paid care work in the economy goes up by 10% if you increase it by the amount I said, right? The spending on elder care increased GDP in the paid care sector by over 20%, right? And the combination of all the policies together this is the changing the wage gap. Sorry, I should point that out. So if you reduce the wage gap between care workers and average workers, GDP in the care sector fell. Why is that?
I don't know.
So the wage gap exercise was that you increase the wages of paid care workers 50% so that they would be closer to the average wage. So wages in care work went up, right? So what happens for the demand for workers when you raise the wage, right? It goes down, right? So that causes a decline. Okay, and then this is the non-GDP care. Okay, so this is care, unpaid care at home. Okay, so if you increase the subsidies for childcare, obviously unpaid care at home goes down, right? If you increase the subsidies for elder care, the orange bar, elder care at home goes down, right? If you increase the wages for paid care workers, the unpaid wages go up, right? Okay, and over here, this is not the care sector. This is the whole economy, okay? So the subsidies to childcare and elder care increased GDP by about 1% for elder care, about 0.5% for childcare, right? And we see that total unpaid work declined, right? Here, both those bars, all right? And, and this is the real value added aggregates, okay? And I just think this is also interesting. We'll just take a second to look at this. So, so this is the childcare and elder care spending. So value added in market production, GDP is market production, value added in market production went up about 0.1%, right? A little bit less for elder care. And the market value of non-GDP production, that is unpaid work, declined by 4% for the child care and 2.5% for elder care, okay? And here we see reducing the wage gap increased GDP, right? And decreased unpaid work. Okay, so notice that even though when the wages for care workers went up, it decreased production in care work, but it had a positive effect on GDP. Why is that? Why would that be? We raise the wages of care workers. Why does it make GDP go up? Obviously, in a room full of microeconomists, the multiplier effect, don't you think? Right? We're paying these care workers more, right? And they're going to spend that money back into the economy. They might hire a babysitter themselves so that they could work more hours, right?
More people working.
Yeah, exactly. More people working. That is
earning income.
Right. Okay, so that's just to try to motivate you on the macro side. Okay, so let me conclude. So I think that what I'm trying to argue today is that we need to move beyond analyzing women as opposed to men and pick up some of the ideas from feminist economics, that we need to really understand the structures that underlie inequality, that we need to decenter markets and focus as economists some of our attention on unpaid reproductive work. And that I wanted to argue that care is really a key emerging area for understanding policies to promote gender equality, and also for understanding policies to ensure the well-being of all people. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I'll stop sharing my screen. If you want to ask me about a slide, I can always share again. Okay, so I'm interested in your thoughts or comments, or share something about your own research or whatever you want to talk about.
Okay, thank you. Anna, do you want to
Sarah had a question here at the chat. Sarah?
Yes. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So it is about the paper from Korea, I think. You say that when the wages for care workers go up, I'm sorry, I'm looking again. I think it was the GDP goes down, something like that, or the woman,
This one?
there's less participation of, yes, there's less participation of women in the labor market. And I'm asking if these wages are only for private sector, because we think of public provision, if care workers receives more, but they are provided by the government, for example, like kindergartens that are free, that are public, wouldn't that like have a different effect?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And it, of course, depends on how you calibrate your macroeconomic model, right? But I think that in this case, they actually calibrated it based on the Korea data. So in Korea, if the majority of the childcare workers are in the private sector, then let's say 70% are in the childcare sector, in the private sector, then they used 70% impact of that wage, right? And 30% impact of the public sector wage. Do you see what I'm saying? So I think that they use the actual mix of private and public sector care in Korea to come up with that number.
Okay.
What it probably cannot do is it cannot incorporate any shift between private and public care that might occur as a result of the changing wages, right? Because they wouldn't know, they wouldn't have any way of estimating that elasticity. But I think that the estimate probably took into account the fact that there are different wages in the two sectors. But
Yes.
I'm not sure. And they might have just used average across, it's possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, thank you for your presentation. I think it was amazing. I am currently researching about public policies in the US during the pandemics, and this care work, especially related to paid leave, family and medical paid leave in the US, is really interesting. And well, it was a great presentation. Thank you. I also started to think about some more work that could be done, especially related to, for example, mental health of the women who are providing care, and some other unobservant characteristics we could implement, like, for example, not only supervising or active care, but simply thinking about the care that needs to be done. For example, thinking about the grocery list, or thinking about who is going to take the kid from school, and etc.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
Right. And of course, that never gets reported, right, on the surveys, right? If you're writing in your time use survey, you never write down that you spent 15 minutes writing the grocery list. I don't think.
Of course.
I wanted to share with you, if I can find it, the link. So we recently held a conference on the Carework infrastructure in the US. And here, I'm going to send you some of the panels were on the topic you were just talking about. So I'm just going to put the link. All the videos and slides from the panels are at this link that I just sent you. And so if you're actually doing research on the US institutions, you might want to take a look at the
Yes, I've watched a few presentations. I couldn't watch yours, but I'm gonna look at the recording. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Other thoughts? Is anybody doing any work related to these issues?
Hi, Mieke. My name is Ana Luisa. First of all, I'm sorry for arriving just at the end of your presentation. I had another appointment, thesis judging panel, but I will, of course, watch it after the whole presentation. But I'm working with time use. I'm in the time use area, and I think you've mentioned that you were working with Brazilian data or something paper, and you know that that we don't have a time use survey.
Why not? Right, you have this funny.
It's unbelievable.
You have this
yes, yeah, I know. Like IBGE, the Brazilian National Survey Institute. Yes, they made a high effort, like last decade, to have a time use survey, but it was really complex to have this data.
And it doesn't separate the care work from the
yes, exactly.
So I don't know.
That's what I would ask you. Like it's a challenge to have a care work data in time use. And that's what I would ask you, like it's how it's a challenge. How can we model without time use, like
I don't understand, 187 countries in the world have this data. I mean, Malawi has this data. Wow, how is it possible Brazil does not have this data?
Yes,
is there, do you have
I don't know
theory?
I don't know
why?
Ask Cynthia. Cynthia works there.
Cynthia works at IBGE. We invited them to come to GeFam webinars. Last year, they went to 2 webinars. We talked to them. We asked them.
Yes.
Okay, Cynthia, help us here.
Yes.
Why?
We don't want to blame her.
They tried to collect some, but we even have a presentation. Right?
Yes.
So they are not going to make available.
Yes. I'm working with like intra-household allocation, and I'm with intra-household allocation model, and I'm working with trying to calculate leisure inequality, gender inequality. So the only data that we have in time use is from PNAD, the most important national survey. And the only data in time use that we have is like work hours at the market, work hours at home, but we cannot distinguish, and commuting. So I got the total week hours and discount, like it's a residual.
Right, residual, yeah.
Yes, like Browning and Gortz, and some papers do this. So it's my, it's my way that to calculate leisure time, but it's it's really a limitation that we have here. And the other thing, but I think with this link that you put here, that I would ask you to say something about, but I'm sorry for my delay. It's about the care economy, like the United States with the Family American Plan. They are putting a lot of effort there, like in the reproductive economy, and do you think like countries in Europe, what's your idea, like the whole, like the other countries, only United States? Because I don't think that Brazil is like having this idea that how important care economy is, like that the public policy, it's not only the productive economy, it's like the reproductive economy that you should care.
Yeah.
So
the US isn't going to do anything now because Congress.
Oh, really?
No, because Congress isn't going to pass this thing because the Republicans are
okay.
Republicans, and
that's a point that
yeah.
So
it's really disappointing. There was a chance that there would be enough votes, but then there's 2 or 3 conservative Democrats who are voting
that they will not pass.
And it will not pass. So nothing is going to happen. But on the general question, I was talking earlier in my talk, I think before you came, about this concept of gender regime or care regime. And if you Google that, there's a number of interesting papers now on Europe, looking at the different ways that different European countries are kind of attacking the care problem overall, right? Which is why they use the word regime, to get this idea that it's not just like one policy. It's the policy about family and medical leave, plus the policy about, retirement benefits, plus the policy about employment things, right? And when you put them all together, they create a kind of, like set of policies that really structure how care gets provided. And so I think it's, that in those papers, I think a bunch of them are by economists, but not all of them. Some of them I think are by political scientists, but it's very helpful. I think even, so I have my paper on elder care in Bulgaria. I sent to this journal called the European Journal for Social Policy, Journal for European Social Policy, GESP. And they were the ones who pointed me at this literature, because I came at it as an economist. I'm like, here's my regression. And they said, where are the institutions? But I really appreciate it. First you're like, oh, more things I have to do, what? But, it was so interesting because there is a real richness in the kinds of different kinds, the countries don't all do the same thing. And there's a very rich set of models out there for us to use and for us to push our governments to develop, and so I think Europe is a very diverse place. There's places like Bulgaria that the government is broke, right? There are no institutions. Good luck with your family problems. And then there are places, like Denmark and Sweden, where they take everybody's money and taxes and they spend it all on care, basically. So when you look at this diversity, you see so many different ways of dealing with the care economy, and I think one of the options that I think is very interesting for lower income countries, middle income and developing countries, is the model that Germany and I think Denmark uses this too, actually, is wages for care work, right? So in Germany, a certain amount of money is allocated for the care of every elder. Okay, so this assumption, says we don't need to determine your care need, right? You as an elder are we're deserving of, or whatever, this certain amount care budget. Here's your care budget. You're older, here's your care budget. And then they can choose. I would like to spend this on a hired care assistant. I would like to pay my daughter-in-law to care for me. I would like to use the money to go to an institution and live in a building with a lot of other old people. Your choice. You spend it however you want. But the amazing thing is, if you pay your daughter-in-law, she gets full labor rights. This is a job. She gets paid leave, she gets pension, she gets vacation. So, you know, sick leave, she gets all the labor rights. So, and as I said, it's not just one European country. There are several. I think it's possible that there's some of that in the Netherlands. I think it's in Denmark too. So if you're a lower income country or a middle income country, this seems to me like a great idea because you have also employment needs, right? You have people in your economy who don't have very good jobs or don't have jobs at all. So pay them to provide the care work. It might be more, I don't know, I haven't done a study of this. Okay, I'm just guessing. It might be more cost effective than building, you know, I mean, even Colombia, you know,
I think, yes, I agree with you. Maybe it's, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I was just going to give one quick, this example in Colombia. So I don't know how, if this is prevalent in other countries, but in Colombia, there was a big push to get women into the labor force. And they knew that they needed to improve childcare for this. And they chose one of these low cost approaches. So they developed this community mother program. I don't know if anybody knows about this. So the government gives money for a woman in the community to become trained as a child care provider. And I think she also gets a small stipend for improving her, you know, living conditions so the kids will be safe. And then she's the paid childcare provider in this village, but she is also now qualified to train other community mothers, right? So if they need another place or another woman wants to take this up, right, this one trains her, and then the next one is also eligible for the government salary, right? And the parents are eligible for this subsidized childcare. So for me, this is brilliant. You know, the rural women needed more income. Plus they're getting training, their skills are improving, right? They might give better care to their own kids and all the kids. And it provides childcare for the other mothers in the village so that they can work or be in their fields without, you know, worrying about their kids and so on. So when I've been doing this work on Kazakhstan, and I feel like for Kazakhstan, this seems like a good idea to me, one of those two models or both of those models, right? Why build a bunch of childcare centers if you have a lot of unemployed women or women who need, you know, jobs or decent jobs, instead of, you know, selling Turkish clothing in the bazaar? You know, maybe it'd be better to do something like this. And I mean, elder care, for sure, the whole same story applies, right? But in the communities. I think Violetta has a question. Violetta is one of our business scholars at American University, and so I invite you. Mexico, by the way.
Yeah. Listening about this program in Colombia, I remember the program that is in force now in Mexico. The program also gives some benefits to women who have children and need to get the children in some caring service. Before that, the money is given to the mother. But before that, we had a system where the money was given to home business or we made the transformation of the system. And my question is, what is better? What of the two systems could be better for children, for economy, and for mothers?
Such a great question, because, you know, it's a kind of neoliberal approach. You know, I'm not opposed to giving the money to the mothers at all, but the thinking behind this is that there should be competition between those childcare centers, right? And so the mothers should vote with their dollars. I like this one versus that one, you know. I don't know if it's better or worse, but I think that's the reason they did it, is they're trying to create competition between the centers. If you give the money to the centers, you know, the centers are probably better able to plan, right? They know they're going to get this money. They can improve the play equipment, they can paint, you know, whatever, but if the mothers are voting with their dollars, the childcare center never knows how much money they're going to get. So they can't paint, they don't plan to make improvements, right? So there's like benefits from both. I don't know if
what I think that happened.
Violetta, can you adjust your microphone? It's a little hard to hear you.
Yeah, what I saw that happened here in Mexico was that many of the business of women, there were business of women owned by women closed, and women who receive the money, the mothers, use the money for other things, and the caring of children are in charge of the parents of the women. So I don't know what is better. I don't know if it was a good change. Really, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a disadvantage too. The money doesn't go where you intended.
Yeah, no.
Okay, anything else?
Just one, I think I've read that an economist said that the technology and automation, like it's a good thing for the care economy, because the workers who not follow who are putting aside from the technology industry, they can go to this market to work in this, to the care economy.
Interesting.
Yes, because it's just one thing that come up here.
Also, there was a paper I saw at one point called "Are Robots Caring for Grandma?" or something. It was also about automation in the care industry. I didn't read the paper, but apparently there's a discussion about that.
Poor people.
Poor grandmother.
Not even in the care market, the robots they are invading even the care economy.
Yeah. I think there's another hand up.
Monica, do you want to
I'm trying.
question? Okay.
My name is Monica. I work with Anna at University of ABC. I was wondering about the Black women. We are trying we are starting a research about Black women and the labor market. And we have some data that show us that in care, occupation related to care, to caring children and caring elderly, we have women are the mostly frequent, I think in 92 or 97% of the distribution. And we saw, in addition, that Black women, brown women and Black women have the lowest income in this kind of occupation. In Brazil, we have some historical issues to have in this. We are trying to relate to the historical economic occupation as part of the question, but we are wondering too if in other scholars have find some positive effect to include this kind of intersectional inequality in GDP, or if reducing the wage gap, if it have some improvement, or just having some regulation, a few effect over the jobs, the formal labor market, or something like this. What, in other words, sorry because of the confusion, what kind of effects do you think we can expect for reducing inequality on intersectional inequalities in this specific kind of occupation of caring work jobs?
Yeah,
I'm not sure if I was clear. Sorry.
I'll try to respond. So, this is such a big problem in this sector because already care services are unaffordable, right? Parents cannot pay for childcare. In the United States, childcare is like $10,000 a year or more, right? And elder care is even worse, right? Because if you need skilled elder care, it's extremely expensive. People go bankrupt paying for the care for their parents. So, and at the same time, the people who provide the care make poverty wages. They have to go to the food bank and get free food, literally, I'm not exaggerating, in order to get through the month. So it's such a crazy thing that the workers in this industry are living in utter poverty, and the people who are paying for the services are also being impoverished, by the need to pay for these services. So it's a pinch, and we could talk about what the cost problems are on this, but the basic idea is that these services are a public good. And because they're public goods, governments need to subsidize these products, right? We cannot treat them like products in a market that people are going to produce, and then the consumers are going to pay the cost of producing them, because it's just not going to work. So this was one of the important topics at that conference that I was talking about earlier in the talk, and the link I put in the chat, because at the conference, one of the things I was very pleased about is it wasn't just academics. It was academics, people from labor unions, people from advocacy groups, people from immigrant groups, because many of our care workers in the United States are immigrants, often undocumented immigrants, right, who are paid even less than all the other brown and Black people in the US. So it's recognized as a big problem. So in the United States, the unions are really trying to use this Build Back Better plan that's not going to get passed through Congress, but trying to use this as an opportunity to raise awareness. So I don't know at all how things are in Brazil, and it really depends on your institutional structures. But in the United States, thinking about elder care, home health aides, as these people are called, are paid for by Medicare, which is the government medical insurance provided to every citizen over 65. So that means that the government is the employer of these workers in the last instance, but the government never hires them, right? There's some kind of intermediary, because of neoliberalism, private sector institution that hires the workers, and the government pays the institution. So but what the unions are trying to do is to argue that even though these small local businesses which hire and supervise the care workers are the employers, that really the employer is the government. Because it's very hard to unionize workers who work at little tiny firms that offer care workers to individual households, but it's easy to organize government workers, right? So the unions are trying to make this legal argument that the government is the employer, and to call that the bargaining unit, right? And to try to organize these workers as government employees. And because the states, that is the individual states of the United States, right, are on the front line of this, even states that are more conservative might be interested in this, because the states have to deal with the problem of providing care, right? And the fiscal burden and the organizational burden and so on. And so the states actually have been somewhat cooperative in this, trying to set up a kind of tripartite negotiations between the firms that employ the workers, and the government that pays the bills, to try to organize this. And what the unions are trying to do is to both raise wages, but also to raise the quality of care, to provide training to people, right? So that they can also have sort of career tracks, right? You could start by providing just the most basic services. You bring groceries, you help bathe, but then you could get trained. So now you can do basic medical procedures, and you could earn more money. So there would be like a career trajectory for this. But it's a very long battle, because we first have to convince the government that this is a public service, right, that needs to be paid for. And, I think Denmark has succeeded in convincing the government, but in the United States, we still have kind of a long way to go. But again, I don't know about the structure in Brazil, but in the United States, these battles can be fought at the state level. So there are some states on the West Coast that are really making progress. Washington State and Oregon and California are really making progress in these areas of organizing these workers, giving them some labor rights, raising their wages, raising their qualifications. And then, of course, places like, Alabama and Mississippi and Texas, it's like terrible, nothing is happening. So I don't know, maybe in Brazil too, you have the ability to kind of push in some cities or some, states or wherever you have a little bit more political room, because this is a political problem, right?
Thank you very much. I'm sorry for the confusion with the screen.
Other things?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Anna, do you want to?
Okay, so we're gonna end the recording. I want to thank Professor Meurs for coming today, speaking to us.
It was a pleasure, really pleasure. Great to talk to you. If you
Thank
have
you
any
very much.
questions, feel free to email. I'm happy to chat more.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation
You're welcome. Maybe
and
I'll
your
see some
ideas.
at IAFI. Looking forward to it. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.